Hi everyone, good afternoon. Instead of the usual Friday update with the top 10 and everything, today we got a special stream, which we're going to be talking about some cool stuff. So before we do that, we'll say who we are. This is Ben, he's the designer, a designer. I'm JB, I'm a programmer and here for the UI design part of it. And we're going to be talking about mages and as well as their abilities and how you make them and use them and such in the game. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. Ben's going to start with going in depth about mages.
Right. So if you guys were looking for the top 10 that we usually do, that's going to be in the email update that we send a bit later. To start talking about this, we've recently added mages to the game. Previously, we had the fighter classes, the archers, and healers. So this is our fourth trio. There's one per realm, so they're not mirrored. Each one has some components in common, but as you'll see as we get into this, their abilities they end up creating are almost all entirely different. To sort of start things off, Max, if you've got the general or the basic tab there in the list.
All right. Pulling that up. All right, you guys are small, and the basic abilities are up.
All right, so this is just a list of sort of standard basic stuff that all of the classes, as you can see somewhere around us here.
It'll be over there.
Yeah, is the list of some basic things here. So you have traits, which if you guys are not familiar with the game, there are banes and boons that you pick during character creation, which can give you some advantages, but have to be compensated by some disadvantages to your character. And these are some of the just standard ones that all the classes get access to. And along with that, there are some pre-built abilities here, and these will allow you to do things like use a sword, use a hammer or whatever for different types of weapons, and to do stance transitions between combat and travel, so you're running faster when you're traveling from place to place, and then when you're in combat, you're moving slower and don't get slowed down by taking damage and things like that. And then there's weapon swap to allow you to swap between different weapons and sprint. Just some basic functional things that every class gets access to. And then as we move over into the first class, which is going to be our Flame Warden. This guy is kind of a, if we can show the screenshot there. This guy is our Fire Mage. He's from the Arthurian realm. His main function is damage along with all the other mages. And so he has spells that mostly cater to dealing straight up fire damage, applying buffs and debuffs to his fire damage and debuffs to fire resistance of enemies, and a little bit of control things here and there as we'll get into a little bit in this. As you can see, each class is going to come with a set of banes and boons, and so these are the at the top of the list there is the ones that are specific to the Flame Warden, so you can sort of glance through some of these. We're going to show these here in this video, and then we're also going to send them out in our email update later, so you don't have to worry about reading through all this really quick while it's on the screen. You can have a look at these in a higher resolution version of this when we send it out later in the email. But as you can see, there are some choices that you can make here in character creation as to what's good and what way you want to specifically play your character, and these also tie into the previous slide where we had this standard banes and boons, because you can pick some from that list and some from this list to sort of mix and match to compensate for the amount of points you need to pay for the things that you want. When we get into the actual ability components, you'll see these are broken up into ability component types, and that's because our abilities are crafted by players and are a combination of these components to actually make an ability, which we'll get into a little bit with the UI later on. But the basic gist of it is here specifically for the mage abilities. Like magic is different from melee and is different from archery. But when it comes to magic, you have a rune and then you have a shape, and that defines sort of the core of your ability. So the rune is basically what the spell is going to do. Like when it hits someone, what's going to happen to them. And the shape is like, how is it delivered? Like, are we throwing a projectile? Are we doing like an area of effect? Like in what way are we trying to apply things to enemies? And so as you look into here, you'll see that there's the ability to do direct fire damage, to deal fire damage over time, to do smoke.
Do you like the ability builder up?
Not the ability builder, just the list of components for the Flame Warden.
Oh, just the Flame Warden's ability components?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And that should just be a sort of a list of these with their descriptions and icons. And so as you look into the list of shapes, that'll sort of show you the different ways that the abilities can be delivered, as I was saying. So you could say a combination of ball with primal fire will give you a ball that you throw, which has a projectile arc and a certain duration before it expires. So it has sort of a longer range than, say, a dart. And that gives you some of the trade-offs in what style of play that you want. Do you want to be more of a long-range bombardment sort of character, which is staying back and throwing these things from far away, but the casting times are longer? It's not going to deal as much damage in terms of DPS than, say, someone who's using darts, which are faster to cast but have a really short range. But they're also better at tracking. So if you're trying to throw a ball at someone who's, say, really far away from you, if they move out of the way because we're using physics-based projectiles, you're not necessarily going to hit them. Versus if you're pretty close and you're using darts that are fast, those are going to have a much easier time hitting targets. And so that's sort of one of the trade-offs there. And there are all these lists of different things. As you'll see when we pull up our next one, which is going to be a different class, a lot of these shapes are common, but the runes aren't. So the runes are specifically to the Flame Warden class, and some of these shapes like dart and ball and things are just common mage shapes that are available to different classes. But a couple of these are unique, like the dart volley and the wall here at the bottom of the list there are specific to the Flame Warden, and the other mages don't get access to those. These are just sort of also starter components, and at a later point we're going to be adding more to this class, more to the other classes that you may have seen in previous discussions and in gameplay videos and demos and things. So this is not an exhaustive list of comprehensively everything that they're going to eventually have access to, and some of these things may change. Some will be pulled out, some will be added in as we get through balancing and iterating on these classes. So just keep that in mind, that this is not a final stamped list of what these guys are going to have at launch. And as we get into the next section here of the focus items, this is sort of your mage equivalent of a weapon, so like a sword or an axe or something. Specifically, the Flame Warden uses a wand, and the different types of wands are going to have different effects on your abilities, so you'll have to pick which of these you equip, and that's going to affect all of the spells that you cast while you're using this class. As we get into the ability builder a little bit, you'll see you don't have to use it. You don't have to leverage its effects if you don't necessarily want them, because there is a trade-off to leveraging the power of your wand in order to cast a spell. But you won't be able to easily switch between these while you're fighting, so it's a pretty big decision of which of these you're going to want to use. And then as we step into the infusions, you can sort of see that these are sort of based around some of the different races that we have in the game. So you'll see things like Frozen Beard, Sorrow Feather, and things like that are going to be items that you'll actually have to pick up from killing enemies, and then you can use those as components in casting spells. So there's a limited number of them that you'll have in your inventory. You can run out of them, but they do provide some extra benefits and things that you can't get any other way to your spells. So that's just a sort of extra add-on that you can put into your abilities that you don't have to have them necessarily, but it certainly can give you some added benefits, but you'll want to perhaps use them sparingly so that you don't run out of them, and you only use them when they're absolutely necessary. And that sort of sums up the overall structure of these, and as we move on into the next class here, you can see how they are similar and how they're different. And so our next class is going to be the Druid, if I'm correct. Alright, so the Druid is the Tuatha De Danann version of the Mage archetype. So he's going to be a different class. You're only going to be able to access that class from that realm. And his sort of thing is he's more of a astral magic caster as opposed to a Druid that you might think of from other systems where they're like a sort of nature healer sort of character. So this guy is actually a damage character, just like the Flame Warden. And he's going to have more of like the void and chaos type magic, whereas the Flame Warden was more directly fire magic. And so you can see in here that his Banes and Boons are all different, and that's going to give him some different advantages and disadvantages. And then his runes are also completely different. So you'll see he has like Primal Void instead of Primal Fire, and then he has some additional list there of things that work a bit differently than the way that the Flame Warden ones do. When we get into the shapes, you can see that the list of shapes starts off pretty much the same, where you have dart and ball, explosion and things like that. Those are going to functionally work the same way across the different mage classes, But then when you get into the lower part of the list, there's things like Projection and Rift that are specific to the Druid, and there will be more of those as time goes on and as we work on developing these classes further. As I was sort of explaining before, this is the reason that there's not a gigantic list of things in here is because this is sort of our first pass at these guys. We have sort of a similar list for our other classes right now that has about the same number of components, and as we get further into beta, we're going to be implementing more classes with lists like this. We're already working on our support trio, so that's going to be the next one that comes after this. But they're going to have a fairly basic set of things to start with so that we can get more of the classes into the game to start, and then we'll be building them out and adding more to them as time goes on. So just keep that in mind, again, as you look at these lists. And again, this has got a focus item, which is a scepter for the Druid, which is a little bit different from a wand, but sort of the same idea where it's a focus item. It's going to have stats on it that determines how good it is, similar to how good your sword is. It's going to be based on crafting. And the different types of scepters are going to have different effects. So you have a lot of trade-offs in here because the Druid, unlike the Flame Warden, doesn't just have a single damage type. Where Flame Wardens are specifically fire, Druids use a mix of Chaos and Void magic. They also have a little bit of Arcane in here as well, which is sort of a rare damage type that doesn't have a lot of resists against it. But for the most part, they're focused on these two, Chaos and Void. And so you see a lot of their scepters have some effect that happens to their Chaos spells and some of the effects that happens to their Void spells. So you have a little bit of a difficult decision to make when you look at their focus item, because you might have to figure out which of the two things you really want to focus toward, and then what the secondary one has as its benefit will have to be compensated for in the way that you sort of align your list of spells that you're building as you're creating your abilities. And then looking at our infusions, you'll see some of these are in common, where we also have, again, the Frozen Beard and Pulverized Diverger, because those are enemy races to the Tuatha realm as well. But you'll see that we have things like the Feline Eye and Singing Stone, which are from things from the Arthurian realm, and you don't have their consuming their own components from the slain Vikings, or from the slain Tuathas, because that's their allies. And the bottom of this list too, I should have mentioned before, there's also some specific infusions to this realm. So like the modeled hieroglyphic disc is specific to the Druid and will come from elsewhere in the game and not necessarily from killing other players. So there are ways to get some of these infusions that don't specifically involve killing enemies, but that will be for their specific effects. So as each one of these is different, you will have to go and source each one of these from its specific source in the game and not necessarily be able to get them all from killing enemies. And then next we will have the Wave Weaver, who again is the Viking version of the Mage archetype. And yeah, just walking through this again, this is going to be very similar by now as we've looked at the previous ones. This is more of a water-based class, whereas the Flame Weaver is the fire-based class. He goes a little bit more into some of the other damage types, so he has some I think wind damage, he has some frost damage in here as well, and he sort of aligns a little bit with the Winter Shadow, which is the Viking Archer class, because they can both apply frost effects and can have some of their bonuses dependent on whether something has a frost effect on it or not. And so that's sort of an interesting synergy. There's a little bit of synergy that way with the burning effects from the burning arrows from the Blackguard and the Flame Warden as well, but it's a little bit stronger here on the Viking side of things. And so again, the Banes and Boons are unique. The names of these you might have to look up if you're curious what some of these words mean. They're from Norse mythology, and that was something we wanted to theme a little bit more heavily in mage classes in general, and specifically into the Vikings, because a lot of the way that the Viking structure and lore and backstory goes into the actual historical mythology of them. So you might have to look up some of these words. I know GB doesn't like trying to pronounce the wacky names of some of the characters. I have no idea how to pronounce
most of them. So,
but Max does. So if you need to know how to pronounce something, be sure to ask Max. And yeah, so their runes are primarily focused around water and frost based damage. They have a little bit more control here because they have frost, which as its sort of side effect is a slowing effect, so it freezes things and slows them down. So they have a little bit of control that way, whereas fire is more like damage and damage over time. So the Flame Wardens are a little bit more towards damage, and the Wave Weaver is a little bit more towards control, you might say. Again, their list of shapes is very similar to what we've seen before, with a couple of extra things, their wall and their trap, which I think is going to be specifically interesting in the way that it's implemented, because you can sort of cast a spell that only your allies can see, and then enemies who walk over it won't know that there's a trap there until they step on it, and then it triggers. That's not something that is finished in the game. Some of these abilities, if you're going to join us in our test that we're hoping to have this weekend, you might notice that some of the things on this list are not present in the game yet, but we're working on finishing up some of these, as we're also working on some of the things for our upcoming classes as we're moving on into creating support characters. So that's just something to keep in mind, is not everything on this list is necessarily in the game and fully functional. Not everything has visual effects as well. Some of the spells don't necessarily have a particle effect that goes with them quite yet, but that's also something that we're working on the art side. So just keep that in mind. This is all very much a work in progress if you're going to be looking to try some of this out in the tests that we're doing this weekend. Moving on from that, there are focus items. So the Wave Weaver has a gauntlet in particular, which isn't to say that it's necessarily an armor item, so you'll have a normal glove, but then there's a gauntlet that goes over the top of that that sort of differentiates his visuals from like a Flame Warden or a Druid, which are actually holding an item in their hand. And those are going to be something that we'll show you the art for a little bit later. I don't think we quite have all the concept art put together for those, but that's just something to make him a little bit unique. But it functions pretty much the same way, where it's a focus item. It provides, each one of these provides a special and unique effect to all of the spells that you'll cast when you equip one, so you'll have to pick which one of these is important to you. And then moving on into infusions, this is again sort of the same type of thing, where we have infusions that come from killing enemy characters, and then a few of them that are special and will come from the world, and different ways that you'll go about picking up different items from crafting nodes and killing creatures and things like that as we build out more of the game world. Right now, if you're looking to use these in testing, we're not actually charging you the consumable cost for these yet, and we're not dropping them off of characters, so you'll just be able to go in and use your abilities and not worry about running out of any of these. So for right now, it's just something that we can freely test and see how things go, and try to do some initial balancing work and see which of these things are too good or not good enough, and adjust from there. And so that's pretty much the overall rundown of these guys as far as what they've got in the game right now. Again, not everything will be perfect. This is they're still very early on in their development cycle, but they are in the game, and if you decide to join us for our weekend test, you'll be able to pick these characters and play them, and let us know what you think. And then JB is going to explain, as we've been showing you the components in these lists, how these components go together to actually make an ability, because we're just showing you here lists of, what are all these things, and those have to be put together before you actually make an ability that works in the game. So I think we'll go through the UI a bit for that.
So if you pull up the builder image, you have that up. All right, over here. Great. Okay, so first thing you'll see on the left side of that image is like the first page of the builder. And you'll notice that even though this is for a mage, you'll see that it says you can make melee abilities, magic abilities, and archery abilities. That right now is not currently in the current iteration, like mages just do magic, but that is just to know that they can also do these other things, just not as good as magic, because they're a mage. So in the middle, next to us, you'll see the builder. So if you were to select magic, you'll see that that's how you create an ability using these components. You'll notice on the top, it's divided into sections about like the types that Ben talked about, of how you put together these components in order to create the ability. Some of them are required and some of them are optional. Sometimes you have some additional choices, more than just like selecting the component. But for the mage specifically, you have your primary thing right at the top. There is your rune that you select, which is like what type of damage it is and like the effect that comes from that ability. Then right below that, you'll see your shape, which you get to choose any one of those shapes after you select your rune. Below that, then you'll see your focus item, which on the current iteration, you'll see that it only says use focus or don't use focus. The way that's going to change in the future is that you'll have focus types there that you can select. So you can say use a focus, like this ability uses, like it works with my certain type of focus. I don't know all the names off the top of my head. Ben knows them. But so you can be like, this ability works only with this one focus because you want to use it with that focus. You can totally say that. But you can also say, use it with this focus if I have that focus equipped. If I don't, then it doesn't use it. But it still is castable.
Yeah, so this is one of the things we wanted to do in terms of minimizing the number of abilities that you have to make, just to have variations in what spells you can cast. So we didn't want to necessarily say that you have to make another copy of every ability that you want to use for every different focus item that you have. And so you can basically say, by simply changing the focus item that you have equipped, you still want to gain the effect of your focus item, whatever it happens to be, based on whatever focus item that you've chosen to put on your character. And so you don't have to necessarily craft a whole new ability in order to use a different focus item.
Yeah, but if you want that ability just to know that this ability has these exact stats because I want to use it with this one focus, you can do that. Or you can just say use any focus that I have
because
equipped.
you may not want, if you have, say, the Petrified Wand here, if we're looking at the Arthurian list, right? Which increases the stability of your magic abilities. That will also increase, say, your blood cost of it. So you might not want to pay that extra cost for some spells that already have, say, enough stability, or they cast so fast that they don't tend to get interrupted. So you might want to say, for that ability, if I have this wand equipped, don't even bother using it, because I don't want to pay the extra cost. But if I have a different wand equipped, like, say, the Scorch Wand, it does extra damage, so if I have that one equipped, I do want to use it. So you can say which of the focus items you actually care about when you're crafting your abilities. So I think that'll be a helpful way to allow players to not have to build as many abilities in order to take advantage of these different focuses.
And similarly, below that you'll see infusions, which is a completely optional thing that you can decide this ability doesn't want to use any infusions at all, or if you're going to use an infusion, you can use this infusion. And use this infusion, and then you have additionally, you're going to have a checkbox of use this infusion, but if I don't have that infusion, still let me cast it. So that way you can have the customization of that ability however you want it without having to make all these other extra abilities. So you don't have to I want to have an ability that uses crushed human skulls, and I want one that doesn't use crushed human skulls, then having to swap between them when you run out of, crushed human skulls or whatever.
So for an example here, we'll say this Bog Ooze infusion. This adds a knockback effect. So you might only care about casting that spell for its knockback effect. Well, you might still care if it does damage a little bit, but you might want to specifically use it for that. And so if you run out of that infusion, you might want your UI just to inform you, hey, you can't use this anymore because you were using this specifically to get this added effect, and you're not going to get that effect because you ran out of ammo for it, essentially. And that is, again, just another convenience feature that we're trying to put in to make this a little bit more intuitive and friendly for players who are going to be new to this system. It's fairly complicated, so we're trying to streamline it as much as we can. And again, we're still looking for feedback on this. So if you have ideas on ways you think that it could be better, or if you've tried it out, we encourage all of you guys to, of course, join in our playtests and try this stuff for yourself, and then leave feedback for us on how well it goes.
Yep. And by default, we're trying to select the most logical defaults for people who don't care, won't want to get too in depth with these things. Just click 1, 2, 3, create ability, and you can do that. Because then we'll get down to the bottom section there, where it's like the preview section of the ability that you want to make. You'll have a summary at the bottom which will list the name of the ability, which is completely customizable by you. You can name it whatever you want. We have a pretty hilarious automatic name generation, not really an algorithm, just a script that Bull wrote, which kind of takes the names of the components that you've selected and give you something like Primal Ball of Voidness or whatever, something like that.
If you do not select a name for your ability, one will be chosen poorly for you.
Yes.
Explosion of husky primal voidness.
Yes, that's what that one says in the picture. Okay, yeah. So that gives you a name. Not only do you get to select the name, however you want, you also select the icon or whatever you want, which we don't have pictured here, but you'll see that there's that icon to the left there. You can click on that, and then it'll pop up a little modal where you have hundreds of icons to choose from. We'll want feedback on how you like that. If you just like, right now it's just a big rectangle of tons of icons which you scroll through and just pick whatever one you want. So you can make a mage ability that has a sword icon if you want. We're not going to restrict you that way. It's just, your choice, your freedom of choice on how you want it to look in your bar so you can remember it. You'll also see on there a description that is created from like a combination of the components to give you an idea of what the ability does. So if you name it something and you forget it, the description will tell you what it does. And then below that, you'll see the components that make it up. So because an ability is a completely custom ability, like its identity is the components that it's comprised of. So you can see in the example, there's 4 icons there, which is the 4 selected components that are being used for this ability. And then additionally, other than that, you'll have some stats there, which are not currently shown in the current version because getting stat information is hard, and we've not finished that yet. For like printing, hard to get it in a human readable, makes sense way.
Yeah, the data is a bit scattered right now. Some of it's in C# files, some of it's being pulled out as CSV files, and it just needs to be composed in such a way that it can be sent to the UI so the UI can fill it in. So that data all exists. It's just a matter of getting it to where it will display. So eventually you'll be able to really see what does your ability do exactly, like how good is this ability, or how much damage is this one going to do versus that one going to do as you're building your abilities, so that you'll know what you're building is good or what's better than something else.
And so going into that, how does that work? Let's just go right from the builder, because the next thing you do here is you click create and you get the ability, and right now it'll just pop up on your bar. But what eventually will happen, you'll get the choice of add to your hotbar right away, or just like view it in your abilities interface, which if you open up the abilities image, abilities UI image, so this is the abilities interface. This is basically what you have right now. Well, we'll have next week, on Hatchery at least, and then there'll be some more added in eventually. But you'll see on the left side is just a list of abilities. They're categorized. So on the far left side, you have some navigation of basically. You'll have like magic abilities, melee abilities, archery abilities, and like miscellaneous abilities, as Ben talked about way back in the beginning of like standalone component things that are like change stance.
Yeah, you got stance
some
changes, you've got
things.
sprint and some other stuff that these aren't really component driven. There's no other way to like modify them or combine them or whatever. These are just basic functions that your character has that are being treated as abilities, because you'll just bind them to a hotkey, put them on a button, and execute them the same way, but they're not composed from components in the same way that your class abilities are.
Yeah, but so the ones that you have created in this example image, I think just shows Primal Fire for all of them, because it's just an example concept art that Koo made. He did a great job on that. You'll see that there's the name, the icon, and stuff, and then in the top right, you'll see there's a little edit icon, because you can also edit these things. So say I named the ability the Husky Primal Voidness thing, and I don't like that name, after the fact, I can just click that edit button, and it'll take you right back to the builder, and you can just re-enter a different name and click create again, which will essentially just save it and replace your last ability with that the new information that you've done. So you can change the icon too. You can change the name. You can go and decide, I didn't actually like that one infusion I was using in this ability, and there's another one that is similar, that has a similar effect but a different value. You can change that out while still letting it like stay on your bar, because it's like that same ability, right? So you've put it on a bar or a few bars.
Yeah. So if you've bound a hotkey to it, you've got it on a spot on your screen, and you like that ability, but you just want to change something about it, you can go in there and change it, and you won't have to like readjust your UI or resave it and re-put it on your screen or anything.
Yeah. So you can edit it. You can then also delete it there if you want. And see all that you have there. There's some filters and all that in the interface. Just general navigating around all of the abilities when you have a bunch of them. On the middle section of that image, you'll see that there's your components. So components, you'll be able to view them in the abilities interface. They're related to abilities, not the abilities themselves, but they're what make up the abilities. And then those are the things that you have proficiency on. You'll have the component icon and name and a proficiency level bar underneath of it, because that's
just basically your progression. How much experience do you have by using that?
So that's your experience in that component, and then you'll see in there the components you've already learned, and then the ones that you've unlearned or you haven't learned yet. There's a check mark to see those. Although in the game right now, you know everything that is available to you. There's no learning new and unlocking new components right now during testing, just because we want everyone to test everything. So you'll see those there. And then to Ben's point about seeing how does this ability work and what kind of information we have, if you go to the next image of abilities metrics. Okay, here. On this screen, which is not currently going to be in the interface as of next week, because like we talked about, getting all this data together and accumulated we're not there yet. But down the road, we want you to be able to go real in depth on a single ability, just to what does this ability do? Is it good? Is it bad? So we'll have all the data of you've casted this ability this many times, you've used it against these people, it's done this much damage against somebody, it's had this much damage done, this much damage mitigated, this much damage resisted, and kind of based on versus who, I was use this ability how many times on a if I'm an Arthurian, how many times did I use this ability on a Wave Weaver, and how good did it do? You'll be able to go down into the nitty gritty of how good is my ability, just so all the people who really love doing blanking on the order now, number crunching, min-maxing.
Yep.
You can really find out if your ability's good. So we got some graphs in there, so you can really drill down into that data and the numbers, just to know what you're doing in the game, especially with how custom our abilities are. Other than that, last part related stuff, we talked about the bar. Because you're going to have a lot of abilities, our bar is going to be pretty customizable. I'm not want to go in too detail about the bar, but from this abilities interface, or from the builder, when you click create, you have the option there to then add stuff to your bar, which you can move around into. You can have multiple bars on your screen, and they can move around, and you can rearrange the buttons however you'd like.
Yeah, the important part of that, I think, is that it's not just a bar at the bottom of your screen, right?
Yeah.
There's basically a docking point, and then you can stick buttons on it. So you can have clusters of buttons, you can have vertical, horizontal, you can basically align the abilities any way that you want.
Yeah, we call it a bar, but the main concept of it is you have the docking point. Off that docking point, you have a button or multiple buttons that are attached to it, and then the kind of buttons attached to other buttons. So they all just kind of arrange however you want. You can make them in a straight line, you can make them in a grid, you can make them in a circle, you can make them in whatever random shapes that you want, that makes sense to you for how you want to fit it on your screen. But they're all customizable with keybinds. You can have, we're not going to do weird restrictions of you can only have 6 buttons on screen, or 12 buttons on screen, or 50 buttons on screen. If you can make the abilities, you can put them on your screen. There is a hard limit that is pretty high.
There's an upper bound of 300 or something?
The upper bound right now is 300. And that is purely we think that's probably fine.
It sort of is kind of arbitrary,
yeah.
Just because we had to limit that to some extent. If you legitimately think you need more than 300 abilities on your screen, let us know.
Yeah, let us know, and then if we think that's needed, okay, we can change that. But right now, we put that as the limit, just as a. We don't think you need
Just
more.
as a sanity.
Like a sanity limit.
First response 301.
I mean, each of those can have custom keybinds, and they don't have to be single keys either. As well, they can be combinations, like with your modifiers, Control, Alt, Shift, and all that. I think that's about it.
I think so. So that's going all the way from once you pick your class, picking your Banes and Boons, going in and making your abilities, saving them, and then loading them up onto your screen, and then the only part left after that is playing the game. So that's just about everything about mages, everything that we've got at the moment anyway. As I said, there's going to be more as we continue through development. But for now, let's take some questions on that and see what people think.
All right, give us your questions. We have a designer and a programmer here. So if you're asking general production questions about the company, you may need to say those for when Mark is back on.
Well, so we want specifically questions about mages, preferably.
Well, yeah, we want to stay kind of on this
yes.
topic, but I guess you could have production questions about
mages, about ability creation,
Yeah.
viewing, all the UI stuff related to it.
Mages and ability creation. All right. Ryan on the YouTube chat asks, I see performance for specific spells and abilities, but will there be a performance page for your total heals or damage in an encounter, like an in-game damage meter?
So, this is something that I would like to do. Not specifically like a live meter, because of the data aggregation, may not be specifically like real time, because of all the data we have for these things. It may be that these things come from your daily report, of like over the last 24 hours this is what you did, rather than this is what you did in the last 30 seconds. And so that's kind of a dependent on the tech around those stats and when we get that information on those stats.
Yeah, we haven't said that we're doing like a real-time DPS meter.
Yeah.
I think that's maybe something you could build with a UI mod if you really
Yeah, it's something
wanted
you
to.
can build with the UI mod. But whether or not because the amount of depth and detail that we want for it may not be available in real time.
It's just a lot of information because of some of the way that our underlying gameplay systems work and the way that resists work and the way that armor factors in and things. It just doesn't seem to me personally, designing this, that it's going to be necessarily as useful as it would be in another game where you're really caring about raid DPS or something where you're trying to optimize for maximizing DPS. When you're talking about PvP for one thing and then having all these different things that factor in, it's not necessarily going to be that informative to have a DPS meter, because you could just be throwing a bunch of damage out, let's say, that's just not useful damage, and then thinking that you're doing really well when in fact that's not translating into actually achieving victory in battles.
Unknown RH asks, as per the presentation, will the end goal be to have for a class trio same shapes, or are they planned to be different for, let's say, Flame Warden and Wave Weaver?
So, in order to start this out, really, and have an easy start where we could easily get these classes into the game with as little time as possible so that we can get some initial feedback, we made a lot of these shapes the same. Obviously not all of them are the same, some of them are unique. I have definitely got a list on my computer of a lot more of these things that I would like to get in, and making them a lot more complicated as well, so there's more in-depth to a lot of these. And we did some evaluation on that when we first started speccing out the functionality for the ability system, so we should be able to support a lot more of that. But odds are you're still going to have some of these things in common. There's some question of how much overlap there's really going to be when we get into what's the spec going to look like for launch. But the idea of these classes is to try to make them as unique as possible while saving time and not necessarily just duplicating work for the sake of it as we go. So we don't want these classes to play the same. We want them to have very different play styles and different rules insofar as they're staying within their archetype. But we don't want to necessarily try to make everything absolutely unique just to say that we did, if that makes sense.
Odilvik asks, I see abilities have proficiency. How much more effective will skills become due to proficiency over time with practice?
All right, that's a really good question. So, what we are targeting is a fairly gradual improvement to a moderate degree as far as the amount of actual power that you'll get out of things. So, you're not looking at like the difference between a level 1 character and a level 50 character in a typical MMO where you're hundreds of orders of magnitude. You start doing 10, 20 damage and you're doing hundreds of damage or thousands of damage by the time you get up to max level. We're basically treating this like you're starting with a character who's at max level for a MMO, right? You have a roughly equivalent amount of health and damage and everything as a character who's much, much more progressed as far as endgame is concerned. So you're going to have, maybe 20, 30% increase in something like damage, but not something like 50%, 100%, 300%, 500% damage. But those are all numbers that are up for balancing, right? So as we haven't gotten into balancing progression yet, we haven't really looked at what's the cumulative difference between the amount of increase that you get off of your armor, the amount of increase that you get off of your stat increases, because you're going to have better stats that will give you better base attributes for your character as well. What's the difference between better focus items, and then what's the difference from the proficiencies that you get? What does all that add up to as far as a stronger character? And is it too much when we say, well, what's a totally maxed out top of the line character look like versus a new character coming into the game? Because we don't have a broken up world or a tier system or anything like that. New characters are going to walk into the same battlefield that veteran characters are in, and they need to be able to play together. So we can't have a gap that's too extreme, but at the same time, we do want to have some power progression so that you feel like your time investment is worthwhile. So that's going to be a tricky balance, and I don't have an exact answer for you as far as what is the exact number. Is it going to be 15%, 20%, whatever? But it is going to be on the lower end. It's not going to be 100% or more where you're doubling your damage or tripling your damage when it comes to these characters, because that, in addition to having better defenses from equipment and having better crafting stats for your weapons and stuff, is going to be too much. So we're trying to keep that as minimal as reasonably possible to make sure that everybody's competitive, but we also want to make sure that that you're feeling that advantage from gaining proficiency and effectively leveling up your character.
Real Life Gobbo asks, will you be able to press one ability to open another ability bar?
So you wouldn't make an ability to create another bar, but you can have keybinds to swap bars or show and hide bars. Though that's not specifically like creating an ability to do that, but for the feature of you want to be able to click a button to show a bar or hide a bar or switch bars, because I guess to go into a little bit more detail, because about the dock thing, the dock has the set of like buttons attached to it. There are 6 essentially tabs on that thing where it swaps what abilities are in each of the buttons, and they'll retain the same keybinds. So you can have up to 6 of them on the same one, on the same single dock, and then the dock will react to each its individual keybinds and everything, as well as you can have multiple docks.
Dino asks, will Hydro Mages get to wear a backpack akin to Mario Sunshine?
I also like to call them Moisture Mancers.
Yeah, there's been some debate on what the name of this class should actually be. One of their status effects is called Moist, which people are infinitely entertained by. That would be cool. They don't currently have to do anything. Just like the Flame Warden doesn't have to like carry around fire in order to use fire. The Wave Weaver doesn't have to actually carry around a jug of water in order to be able to throw water at people. But as we get further along, that could be something that we potentially look into. It's sort of a difficult balance between what are all the extra bits that you stick onto a character in order to have them really have an identity, and how much can we unify and save art time on and make sure that we have the diversity of equipment across the whole game in general that we need. So whenever you're talking about a unique thing for a specific class that's only for that one purpose and really is just serving a cosmetic purpose and doesn't have any specific gameplay necessarily related to it, That's something we have to consider pretty carefully against. Do we have more swords that everyone can use and things like that?
It's not like they're firebenders or waterbenders or.
Yeah, right. It doesn't work quite that way.
It's our version of magic.
Drew Swanberg on YouTube asks, if I had 70 abilities, would similar ones share cooldowns?
So, I guess I'll talk about this one just because I can.
Yeah, sure.
Because Ben's going to answer a lot as the main combat designer. So, cooldowns are based on your component. Because as we talked about in the builder, you saw that the abilities are created by the multiple components. Each component has its own cooldown. And so any ability that shares the same components will all share a cooldown together. Because there's not like a global cooldown, but say you are using Primal Void in almost everything, that'll kind of be your cooldown for most of your abilities that are all using Primal Void. Because you have a limited set of runes. And so when those are on cooldown, you have to just wait for it to come up.
Yeah, so right now the way it's set up, just to give a little bit more information, is that the runes don't actually have cooldowns. So you can cast like Primal Void or Primal Fire as much as you want. The cooldowns are mostly derived from the shape, and that's so that you can't do things like place as many firewalls as you want. So there's a cooldown on that, so you can basically only have one of them up at a time. But we do try to limit cooldowns as much as possible, because it's not necessarily fun to be limited by the game arbitrarily saying, well, you just can't push this button more frequently. So that's kind of how that works. But it is based on components. So if you use one component and that component has a cooldown, nothing else that uses that component can be used until that cooldown is over. But if you don't have overlap and you use different components all the way through, or one of your components doesn't have a cooldown, you can use another ability with that component that doesn't have a cooldown, even though the previous one that had a shape with a cooldown, you can use the same rune as the other ability, and that doesn't actually overlap.
Emmer1 asks, will mages have any sort of anti-veil skills or ways to affect or pierce the veil?
Not especially. Mages are kind of at the opposite end of that spectrum, where they are the most affected by it and have to kind of work around it. So there's a stat called subtlety, which is how much does a character's magic perturb the veil, basically, and causes veil disturbance in an area. And so mages, using magic in general, but mages primarily use magic, is what makes the veil kind of angry. And so the more magic happens in an area, the more veil effects start taking place, and the more that starts affecting characters. And so mages have to be careful. They don't have any real workarounds or ways to avoid that happening. They just have to kind of be careful of like how much magic goes on in an area if they want to avoid those effects. Of course, those effects happen to everybody. The veil isn't like biased in most cases towards one realm or another. So if all the mages on both sides are just throwing out as much magic as possible, everybody's going to kind of suffer the effects of that taking place. But mages are especially vulnerable to that, and it's something they have to pay a lot of attention to. But they don't have necessarily a lot of ways to get away from that and avoid it, as some of the other classes, like the Veil Walker sort of classes, the stealth classes have.
Bumble asks, can mages cast barrier spells on allies?
Yes, they can. That's actually what that spell is mainly for. They can do it on themselves, which is kind of the main purpose of that, but they can put it on other characters also.
Guinness asks, could armor, like the Dark Fool's Mask, be a focus for the ability builder? Basically, armor being used as a focus.
Yeah, so the mask isn't actually a focus, or it isn't actually an armor. It is a focus, just like the Wayweaver's Gauntlet. Like, he's wearing it, and it's sort of a thing that he puts on, but it doesn't actually contribute like armor stats. So it doesn't give you any additional like armor class or damage resistance or anything. It's just sort of a thing that he's using specifically for magical purposes, and it doesn't provide any defensive benefits. So that's sort of the way that the focus items are broken up. I think there's a couple of them that cross over. I think the Scald has like a Harmonic Frost Axe that's actually a weapon that he uses as a focus. There might be a couple of other ones. But for the most part, they're separate. So you might see a couple of cases where that happens, but for the most part, it's not.
Zumos Gaming on the YouTube chat asks, the runes so far seem very basic compared to the amount of shapes. Can we expect some more unique runes that really make the class unique?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, the shapes and the runes, we'll see about focus, but those are the two things that primarily make up your ability, right? And so adding more to that pool is something we definitely want to do, and we want to add more melee attacks for fighters, and we want to add more archery things for different arrows and different draw and things for archers. So we want to add a lot more to everybody. This is just a very basic list to get these guys started so we could put them in the game, have a reasonable amount of stuff they can build abilities out of and run around and play and really tell the difference between, this is the way a mage plays and this is the way an archer plays in their fairly, primitive basic form, and see if that's fun and see if it works, and then build from there. Again, we want to go broad more than deep early on, so we're trying to get more of our classes into the game first. So we're going to go from mages into support, and then from there into like devout, I think is next, and really get more of these classes in, but still keeping them fairly basic. We don't want to do too much on one class because it means that the next set of classes aren't going to be in the game yet. And getting more of the classes in their basic form is going to give us a better picture of how combat works, how the game works. Once you have mages and support and archers and fighters and healers all playing together and doing their different roles, we're going to have a better feel for the game than if we just took mages and went really deep and said, well, we really need 30 or 40 of these instead of just, the set that we have here. So there is going to be more as we go, but we're keeping it simple right now so we can move on to more classes.
Do you guys want to do a 5-minute warning now or go more time?
I don't care about time.
If there's a lot more, we can keep going a little.
There are many more questions.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Yeah, this is kind of a special presentation, so we want to give you guys time.
Just wanted to check in. Okay. Dragon50275 on the YouTube chat asks, I'm wondering how many abilities will be statistically tracked at any one time. Are we talking pages of graphs if you have pages of abilities, or just the ones most recently used?
So that's going to be for every ability that you have, will have its own page. And it's not like you'll just have pages of data, of graph data, constantly there, like in your interface. It'll be like the page is created when you'll open it up. It'll say, hey, API server, give me the data for this and give me my historical data, which will get streamed down from our servers based on your historical ability use, and then create those graphs on the fly as needed. But yes, every single ability you have will have all of that information, like as much information as we have about it.
Strike asks, will spells use both hands or only one hand? And if so, which one? Can you dual wield spells?
Let's see, does anyone do that? So for mages specifically, they're using their focus, whatever it is a gauntlet or a wand or a scepter. Let's see. It's a hard question to answer right off because I haven't gone back through and reviewed what everyone else does in our like 30 classes or whatever. But for mages, they specifically use their wands or scepter or whatever their singular focus item. There are separate tracks. Mages are really only using the one skill track, so they can only really cast one thing at a time. I think when we get into support, you're gonna see a little bit more of the separate tracks because they can like maintain a song like while they're doing melee attacks and stuff. So you'll see them multitasking a little bit more. Some of the classes that have like auras or persistent things that sort of last over time.
Well, also melee can use left hand or right hand.
Yeah, that's true. So you can use that with melee characters for sure. So there are some cases where the different skill tracks actually play into that. Magic doesn't do it as much, at least for the mage classes.
But about the handedness though, like depending on the focus, you could have multiple equips, so you can use the different abilities without having to like swap because you have the left hand, right hand.
So right now, like the way that the animations are set up is there's like one way that you can cast, which is like with a right hand focus. So they're limited to being right hand only. So you can't actually do a like left hand wand. So you can't do
mask focus and a wand.
I was trying to think if somebody does that. I think like the
Yeah.
Hellbound has like a mask and a
So I
staff.
thought they had a staff and yeah.
The Hellbound does.
Yeah.
We'll have to get into that a little bit later. That's not on the to-do list today. But yeah, mages are fairly straightforward. Again, we might as we continue into testing, there's certainly a possibility that we'll discover, hey, this guy needs a little bit more, or this would be really cool. Let's try this other thing out, and we'll iterate on it, and we'll say, okay, well, let's try this, let's try that, and if for some reason we're like, it would be really cool if mages could cast 2 spells at the same time, and then we'll ask our animators and be like, can you make it so that he can be doing one thing with one hand and another thing with another hand? They have nothing to do with each other, and it blends nicely. Maybe it'll work, and then we can put it in the game. We'll see. Right now, it's not on the spec for these guys, but you never know.
Savardi asks, what is stopping one from just making a myriad of abilities and just going through them, not really caring about the tactical use of them?
Getting killed?
Yeah, nothing really. I mean, if you just want to make a bunch of abilities and not really pay attention to what they do, not really care what their good use cases are, and just like mash the buttons and see what happens, you can do that. I mean, you could do that with any other game too, right? You could just level up your character by running up to enemies and pushing all the buttons and seeing what happens. It's not necessarily going to work out very well for you, because abilities do tend to have specific applications and specific use cases where they do the best. So picking the right ability for the right situation is kind of important. So if you're not doing that, you're probably not going to get very good results.
Teluane asks, how will the crafters fit in the ability creation? It looks like that is only for fighting characters.
So that's a really good question too. And again, we're not really talking about crafters today, but crafters again are a class. So they're going to have not only the crafting system, the crafting interface, as we've sort of shown off a little bit, which is available, I think, if you go into the game right
it's
now.
available in the game right now.
You can get in and see the new crafting
you
interface.
go interact with the Vox.
Yeah. And so there's that part of them, but they also have a sort of combat part of that class. They're not necessarily good at just like 1v1 combat, but they can set traps, they can use siege engines. There's a bunch of things that we want crafters to be able to do, but how much they're going to actually be like not crafting, I shouldn't say. Like, we do call it ability crafting just because that's colloquially what it is. It's ability building. But how much the crafter class actually has to like build their own abilities from components and do things is something we haven't really gotten into a whole lot, because it might be that they just are more of the simplified abilities that we showed in the basics list at the start of this, where using a siege engine or deploying a object like a spawn point or a defensive barricade or whatever is just something that they can just do without necessarily having to say, I deployed the spiky barricade with extra spikes because my component said to add extra spikes or whatever, because that might just be abstracted into the crafting recipe itself, where they just craft it that way and then they can deploy it whatever it happens to be. And so we haven't really gotten into all of that. Again, we're not working on implementing crafters as a separate class right now. We have a lot of crafting systems in where you can use the Vox and craft items and things. But when we get around to actually doing the very low level design of like exactly how does all this mechanically work for crafters, then we'll start talking about things like that.
But like you said, when mages can also do like melee and on archery, like crafters will.
Oh yeah,
have
crafters can do that too, for sure. So
Yeah,
you could just be a crafter and pick up a sword and then go do.
and you'll
slashing
have to
attacks.
make a melee ability for that. To do your slashing attacks.
Well, that's sort of what this
Well, there's
basic
basics.
list is,
There's
right?
basics, yeah,
Yeah.
but-
So you could just say you have like a pre-made slash ability. So any weapon that has a slashing stat basically on it, so sword, axe, whatever, you can just use that basic attack with that weapon, no matter what class you are. And then the more advanced attacks are more specific to fighters, and then those are component based, where you'll have to figure out what's your weapon potential and speed and all those other things. So for when you're a crafter, you won't have to worry about any of that. You can just pick up a sword and hit weapon attack, and you'll be able to attack with it just fine.
Mumblefish asks, will any mage spells be ground targetable, as in cast at cursor, not at target or self?
So we don't have that actual widget right now. We have a range targeting arc. so you can do like a projectile to location area of effect, but you can't just do a like click spell, drag circle around the ground, click, and then have that happen at that location. That's something that I think I would like to be able to do for some abilities. Maybe not specifically for mage abilities. Like they have a specific like ground ability, but right now it's only works on them specifically, so you can basically cast it at your feet, and then it persists in that area.
There's like the wall spell.
The wall sort of does that too, where it just kind of happens right in front of you. I would like for the ground one to actually happen like at the position of your target, but like getting your target's position and then finding a location in the world is like a little bit of an extra step. Again, because we're very work in progress here right now. This is all just coming into the game and being playable for the first time not too long ago. And a lot of the features of these guys, they came in with very, very few of them, and they're getting more and more as time goes on. And so that's something that I would like to be able to have and be able to try out is doing ground targeting that sort of way. But that's a feature, basically. It's to say I can pick a place in the world from the user experience side of things, and that's something we don't have in the game yet. But I would like to do that for at least some things in the future.
Demi asks, with the ability system, will I be able to cast a spell that I can later detonate with another ability? Like a slow-moving bomb that I can remotely detonate?
I'm trying to think of an example of that. So nothing in this list. The closest thing to that would be the, let's say, amorphous projection. Yeah, so the projection for the Druid is sort of this like slow-moving tracking projectile. So it sort of hovers above the ground and just sort of wanders towards your target. And if you shoot it with another spell, it explodes. It doesn't do its ability reaction yet. One of the things we should probably talk about a little bit, maybe, is the ability interaction system, which hopefully most of you guys have heard of. Maybe some of you haven't. One of the things we want to do with Magic in the long term is when two magic spells collide with each other, there is a resultant interaction that does something interesting. So the classic example of that is when a water effect hits a fire effect, you get a steam effect, and then that will, like, superheated air, deals damage to characters around the vicinity. Stuff like that happens when any two types of magic interact with each other. And there's a whole table of these things of, like, what happens when, void and frost interact? Well, something cool happens, and we'll describe what all those things are later. But the system that has to do that, to do those lookups, essentially, because the resultant effect isn't necessarily comprised of the functionality of either of the two interacting effects. So with ice and void, right, the result of that will be something that's in an interaction table that I don't have in my head right now, but it will be something different that's not actually one or the other of those things. It's something new. And so looking that up and then playing it is a system that we have to actually build out. But that will allow us to do some really interesting things when spell effects hit each other, and then that sets off a secondary effect in those interactions. So there isn't really anything specific where you're like plant a bomb and then detonate a bomb in the mage list right here. But there are things like that where you can put down a firewall, for example, and then throw something into that, and then have a resultant effect happen that might create some interesting gameplay.
Folks, we're asking questions focused around mages and the ability system for now. So we're gonna focus on those questions. Sir Onsington asks, with the magic system in regards to air, can you envision crafting quick shot abilities capable of neutralizing other magic and arrow projectiles in midair, like skeet shooting with a shotgun?
So the difficulty with that, I think, is going to be actually targeting them, because you can't like tab target all of the possible projectiles that are going on, because that would be a little bit nuts. But certainly anything static, like the firewall we were saying earlier, where it's just a static thing in the world, you can use the manual aiming mode. Maybe not everybody is familiar with. You can, when you're targeting things in our game, it's a traditional tab target game for the most part, where you just cycle through targets, click on targets, and then cast spells, and it will auto fire at whatever that target is. not everything can be targeted in that way. So like say buildings, because we have destructible buildings, or things like a firewall, which is not an entity with health per se, but it's a volume that has an effect, which is just a physics collider. You can just use an aiming mode change that allows you to direct an effect in a direction. And so by using that, you can either shoot at a wall, shoot at a location on the ground, shoot at whatever you want, because you don't have to actually tab target through some specific object. You can just aim in any direction. And so by doing that, if you decide that, you know, there are projectiles coming in at you at a certain angle, if you use manual aiming, you can aim your projectiles up and shoot back at them. You won't necessarily have the homing behavior or tracking or anything towards them, but if you aim in the right direction, you'll be able to shoot projectiles out of the air. This tends to happen kind of on its own because projectiles have arcs, and so if you're shooting at somebody else and they're shooting at you, those projectiles are just going to naturally collide because they're following the same path essentially in one way or the other. Our game is also very centric around having large battles, and so when there are hundreds or even thousands of players in an area all throwing stuff around, inevitably some of those projectiles are probably going to hit each other, and so you'll have some of these things happening just coincidentally anyway. So there are, I think, a lot of cases where stuff like that can happen. Doing it intentionally is going to be maybe a little bit tricky, but it's certainly, with manual aiming, it's certainly possible.
Yeah, and one of the really early IT tests, when we used to have a wind wall that would shoot projectiles up into the air, we used to put it out and then stand behind the wind wall, target someone on the other side of it, and just shoot straight towards them. Projectile hit it, launched up in the air, so it would get a much higher trajectory on people's heads. So, you know, that kind of stuff was a lot of fun to do, that we could actually plan that.
Yeah.
Zumos Gaming on YouTube asks, I seem to remember that every class had some kind of unique mechanic, which was revealed during the class reveals. Can we expect to see these unique mechanics in the game soon? Like empath, creating some kind of clone, etc.
Yeah, so a lot of, again, those are from a more advanced list of things, right? So like a few of those things are in, like the Stone Healer has the stone deployables that he can use. The empath does not have his simulacrum yet, but again, that's on the longer list of things to do. What we wanted to do, as we went through and did our post-beta like pass of changes to the ability system to make a bunch of improvements, we put together kind of a minimal list of like, well, what do we need in order to get this character into the game and functional so that we can test them out along with all the other characters and really get the sort of basis of combat happening. Things like Simulacrum are, again, a sort of one-off, right, where it's a special function, it's unique to that class, it like has one use case, and it's fairly time-consuming to implement. We want to get all those things in and make, because I think they make combat a lot more in-depth and interesting. There isn't necessarily just one per class either. There are various things to varying degrees of complexity, where that's not necessarily like their whole identity is built around this one thing. In most cases, there are cases where it's like that with like spirit pets, where like that entire class is built around having pets, and if we didn't have pets, we wouldn't have that class. The empath is more built around healing, and so he can do a lot of healing and health transfer and stuff without necessarily having that simulacrum as his like core mechanic. And so we decided we could go forward without necessarily having that in at first, but I still would like to get around to those as we have time, but we want to get a lot more classes into the game first and then start going deeper into, well, what are the cool things we can add to each of these classes and really build them out to have more functionality. And at that time, I think we'll have a lot better experience too, because we will have been playing the game for so long and having so much more experience of, well, what do players like about it, what players not like about it, what's worked, what hasn't worked, to say what those next things should really be. So maybe at that time we decide, you know, the empath, he doesn't really need that anymore, but here's another cool thing that he would do that could make him even better. And so we'll see how that all sort of lands as things pan out. But again, just trying to get a lot of classes into the game right now so that we can have these battles happening, so that we can get our core combat experience all working, and then we'll start adding more as time goes on.
Zyruz asks, will mages be restricted to magic, or can you do like an enchantment on your weapons and fight melee?
Yeah, that was something that was in the more complicated list, as I talk about, again, adding more things to classes, right, was like weapon enchantments. It's not enchantments per se, but it's an effect. It's sort of like reverse barrier, where barrier is an effect on an ally that when they get hit, they retaliate damage back to an attacker, damage or whatever the other effects are, right? Slows or anything else. Being able to apply that oppositely to a weapon, so that when you do a weapon attack, it also does some magic effect to the target, is also on the list of things that I would like to be able to add. I think there was some problem with it. There was some reason that we didn't do that, but I don't recall exactly what that was offhand. But it's certainly something that with more work we will be able to do. So I'm hoping that's one of the things that we'll get on our future list to add to them, because I think that's a really cool way for them to do that. And certainly other classes will need it. That might have been what it was, that we knew we were going to need that for some of the other classes, because they do a lot more with
doesn't the
melee
Mjolnir
hybrids.
do something like that?
The Mjolnir, he sort of does. The way that effect actually works, with the rework and the way that those triggers work now, is he doesn't actually do that self-application trigger. I think there was something in client effects that actually made this not work. This is going way too deep into why, but there are cases where we want to be able to do that. The Mjolnir is a good example of that. Like some of the shapeshifters, I think, are a good example of that, because they're melee hybrids. Like, they want to do melee attacks more, and so they sort of use magic and melee at the same time. Whereas mages are kind of more focused on the magic side of thing and not hybridized, so they're kind of pure in the way that they want to particularly do mage things and not necessarily melee things. But you can always a little bit by having melee weapons and using those, if that's something that you really want to do. It's just going to be not part of their core mechanic and part of their intention. So you can always go against that and do whatever you want, but it's not necessarily an important part of your class. The way that I think I would implement that with mages, again, is sort of like barrier, where you can do it for other people. So if you have a fighter in your group, you want to give him the fire sword, and he can go and deal your fire damage while he has that effect on him. But that's something we'll have to approach in the future.
Loco179 asks, I will say this is very exciting for the mage class. Is this planned for every class?
Is what planned?
What part? The building and all that is planned for every class. Like, they have the whole building and putting components together works very much the same for almost everything. It's just different ways of putting things together, and just have different rules. But they operate through the components that create their abilities. If that's what it is.
Yeah. The ability system. This is sort of an overview when we talked about the ability builder and all that. That's not mage specific. That was the magic network that we went through of, like, magic uses runes and shapes and things, but melee attacks don't use that. But they have an ability builder page, and fighters have to build their abilities just like mages do. So it sort of does work. It's just a little bit different for the different types of abilities. So archery and, I think, there's
shout, there's melee, there's archery, there's magic. We got,
I think there's gonna be
throne.
Songs. Oh, there's
throne is one. I think there's another.
I think there's a song one.
There's a shout.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
The shout one.
Yeah. So there's different ones for the different types of abilities that you'll have.
Yeah,
so
I think there might be another one.
The actual component lists are different in terms of what they do and how they apply.
All right, folks, I think the chat skipped forward because the backlog timed out a little bit. So if I skip your question here, you can feel free to ask it again. We may get to it. There are a lot of questions. Ryan Petrie asks, if I played a year-on-one character and made amazing strong spell combinations that I can't live without, then re-roll a level 1 character and want to copy-paste my other character's spell build, can I?
So, when you start out the game, you'll have a list of abilities already made for your character. So you'll be able to just log into the game for the first time and run around using abilities. You'll have access to the components that those abilities are made from, so that you can then go into the ability builder and rearrange those components and make different abilities. Once you earn enough proficiency in some of those components, you'll be able to unlock additional components and then use those components to either remake some of your existing abilities or make entirely new ones, and so on and so forth as you earn more and more of these components. As a very advanced character, if you're using the components that you've unlocked later in the progression, you won't have access to those components when you first started. But if you're still using a lot of the components that you had in the beginning of the game, because they aren't bad components, they aren't like newbie components or anything, they're just the ones that we give you to start with because we felt that they provided a good basis for that character. So a lot of the time they're actually pretty good because they're kind of forming the core of what you need in order to be a functional character in the game. So if you're still using a lot of those as a very advanced character, then of course you can go back and remake those as a starting character, or relatively shortly after starting if you're using some of the ones that were you unlocked fairly early on in the progression.
And as far as the copy pasteness of it, to get into the details on the interface side, I'm not going to be building that into our official UI, but that's not to say that someone can relatively easily create a UI mod that does exactly that, of taking your abilities, which the UI has all the information about, saving it out to a file or something, or up to their own server somewhere and saving them, and then having it be recreated through a button touch of viewing all the things that you have. Because the API to create these, like how you create these, is we have a public API server that our game's UI makes requests to, just like anything can make to, like a third-party application can make or a website can make requests and create these abilities for your character, provided they have the correct authentication credentials and stuff, which I'm not going to go into how that all works right now, but that capability is there, so somebody could totally, in theory, just make a UI mod that says save all my abilities, and then when you create a new character, load my stored abilities, try to make them if I can, and it can create them all for you exactly as you had them before, so you don't have to manually go through and name them and set the icons and do all that. But that's not something we're going to provide in the official UI, at least not planned to right now.
Adric Cortesia wants to know about the rare-to-use spells, like Death Curse and Divine Intervention. Will they be integrated through this same system?
Yeah, so those are going to be kind of more of the one-off type of things, right? Because if you could componentize those out into a bunch of different things, we would have to invent like a whole class of spells that are specifically that. Versus if we're just making them as sort of these one-offs, where it's like you have the Death Curse or the Divine Intervention, and it's just a button that you can push, like some of these basic things on here, like Sprint. It's just something your character can do, but it's class-specific. I think that'll go a lot faster, and it'll allow us to do a lot more interesting things that wouldn't necessarily lend themselves to like being able to combine with all the other things on your class list. But yeah, we definitely want to get back into having some of those in the game and see how that goes. There's a whole list of them that just need to be done, but they're sort of, again, done as like one-offs, and we want to kind of avoid doing as many of those as possible too early, just because they're a bunch of work and take away time from us getting more classes into the game.
Skylar asks, with this being the 4th class trio, what is the intended playstyle, and how are they supposed to interact with other classes in an RPS way? It is hard to tell from just looking at the components.
Okay, so mages are different in that they deal primarily magic damage. If you look at the other classes, fighters are primarily physical damage, archers are primarily physical damage with a little bit of like elemental here and there, but mages are almost entirely magic damage unless they're also using melee weapons or bows or something. So magic damage, in the way that the damage model sort of works, magic damage is the strongest against heavy armor and the weakest against light armor. Physical damage is the opposite, where it's the strongest against light armor and the weakest against heavy armor. Medium armor is obviously kind of moderate to both, and so it's sort of dependent on that. So fighters have a sort of affinity for having armor because not only does it protect them against the majority of things that are fighting against them, but they get some bonuses to like their encumbrance, so they're not slowed down by it as much, and they're better suited to equipping heavy armor than the other characters are, and they get bonuses based on percentage and things that give them benefits there. So if you're fighting against a fighter, a mage is really good because you're fighting against someone in heavy armor and someone who's going to have a hard time penetrating their armor with a physical attack or just dealing physical damage to them because they have just a high base resist for physical damage. Magic is going to go through that a lot easier, so you're going to do a lot more damage to fighters than say archers will. Archers, on the other hand, are going to do really well against you because you're most likely in light armor. Now, it's not to say that you can't equip heavy armor as a mage, but because you are super immobile and because you're going to be probably suffering some magic backlash damage if you're, say, a Flame Warden, you're going to be taking damage from casting your own spells, or you're fighting against other mages that are from the other realms. You don't necessarily want to be wearing heavy armor, and it leaves you very little room to run away. And once somebody's up close to you, they're interrupting all your spells, so that's kind of bad. So if you're fighting against an archer and you're wearing light armor, they're going to be at range doing very high damage to you because they're cutting through your armor really well, and you're not going to be doing necessarily as great against them because they're probably in medium armor, or they might even have light armor as well. So that's sort of the play on there, is like, what type of damage do you do and what type of damage are you typically strong against. We've talked a little bit about having some additional penalties for mages in terms of their ability to wear heavy armor and get its full effects, to be able to really take full advantage of it, or suffer some penalty just for wearing it, like having additional feedback and taking damage from casting spells while wearing heavy armor just because it's bad for magic and things like that. We haven't really gotten into all of that yet. I'm not sure if it will end up being necessary or not, but there is a definite interaction there between the armor of your opponent and the type of damage that you primarily do, and that's sort of what separates the range damage. In terms of their spell shapes, mages also do a lot of area of effect more than archers do, or fighters do for that matter. And so they have a lot of things that are either do this thing on the ground, or do it in a cone, or explode all around me. And so they can play a close range support damage role as well, whereas archers are really kind of bad at that. They want to be as far away as their reasonable max range is. Like,
unless you're Winter Shadow, but you can swap to melee.
Winter Shadow is a little bit different in that but he still kind of wants to be at like skirmish range, right? He doesn't want to be like point blank. Versus mages, if you're playing a close range mage build, you want things to be like as many things as possible to be right up close to you, so that you can like AoE them with some of these point blank abilities. And again, they're all magic based, so you can set everybody on fire, or slow everybody down, or do whatever you want to a whole bunch of people right next to you. So there will definitely be some potential there. So as we get further along into the support trio, especially, support goes really well with mages because they grant speed, and they can grant blood regeneration, which blood is the primary casting resource that mages kind of tend to run out of, which fighters and archers don't have a problem with as much. Healers do a little bit, and so that will help them as well. So yeah, that's sort of where they fall in what they're doing, is they have a lot of area of effect abilities if they're close. They have a lot of long-ranged abilities doing magic damage instead of physical damage if they're far away. So that's sort of what differentiates them and allows them to play with and against the other classes they're paired with in their realms.
Do you guys want to do a 5-minute warning now?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. 5-minute warning, folks. I'm going to look for a nice question to end with, preferably one that both these guys can answer. Let's answer some more questions while I'm looking. Svardi asks, how do animations get decided for these custom spells?
For the custom spells. Okay, so when you are casting a spell, the animation is primarily determined by the shape, because the shape is kind of how you are instantiating this ability, right? So if it's like you're throwing a projectile, then that's kind of the action that your character does. If you're like summoning an object or creating an explosion or something, that's kind of what you're doing. And then if it's one type, one type of fire or another type of fire, or it's water or it's frost or it's void or it's chaos or whatever, that's less important to the animation. So the animation is going to be the same, but the shape that you're doing is what's going to play there. And then the particle effects that we're going to play are going to be based on the type. So that's going to be, I'm playing a frost explosion, so the particles are frost particles, or I'm doing a water explosion, so the particles are water particles. And so that's sort of the breakdown of that.
Oh man, there are several questions about whether if Wave Weaver makes another mage moist, can you remove the moistness with like a fire mage? Is there a particularly powerful projectile that can catastrophically kill them? Asks Slotoween.
So the way that interaction works is that if you apply that effect to someone and then you apply frost to them, that freezes them. And there are other effects, I think, in here already in this list where you can deal bonus damage to frozen targets. And so first you want to get them moist, and then you want to get them frozen, and then you want to deal damage to them. So that's sort of their setup. The Winter Shadow can also do frost like directly as part of their abilities, so you don't necessarily have to set it up yourself. You can get set up by an ally. But that's sort of the way that works. There isn't necessarily a catastrophic thing that happens, but there is a benefit to setting that up. As far as getting rid of it, of like countering it, there are, like, again, with support classes are kind of the masters of status effects, right? So they tend to apply buffs and debuffs and shear off buffs and purge things and do all that sort of thing so that you can manage what effects are on characters. So they'll be able to remove that as one of the things that they can do. The interaction system should also do some of that as well. So if you cast a fire spell on someone who has a water effect on them, the interactions between those two things can happen on that character as well as if those two things collided actually in the physical world themselves.
Just turn someone into a cloud of steam.
Well, it'll be like centered at their location, basically.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Couple different people have asked, what do you guys think? What's the next presentation you're looking forward to?
Well, I'm concerned. What presentation are you looking forward to?
I think. Well, I don't know if we're gonna go back and do any more talking about the existing classes. We've had fighters and healers and archers in the game for quite a while. I don't know if we'll actually talk about the updated version of them as we've gone through and updated all of the abilities for all the classes to get to the state that we're at now as we're adding mages. The next trio, as I've said, the one that we're working on, starting to work on presently, is the support. And so that'll be the minstrel and the skald and the... I don't want to say bard, it's the dark fool, right?
Which one? Support?
For support.
Yeah. I forget its name.
And so that will be the next trio that we're actually putting together, and so that'll probably be the next one that we sit down and do a talk about once they're ready. Again, ready in so much as mages are ready. They'll get a pass kind of like this, where they have this scope of a list of things that they can do, just so that we can get them in the game and playing, and then run around and group with them, get a lot of benefit out of having songs, and get more of the core gameplay of running around in that group and having that group dynamic gameplay that we want.
For me, I guess I would say probably when we actually get in the social systems that we have planned.
That'll be fun too.
And going over that stuff will be fun, and just having it in game.
Be able to make friends.
Make friends, yes.
Yeah.
And guilds and groups and all that.
All right, you guys ready to wrap up the Mage presentation?
Yep, I guess so.
All right, well, thanks for watching, folks. Keep an eye out for the top 10-ish, which will be going out in the the email update that we do on Friday evenings. We didn't read it on stream because we had a Mage presentation.
Yep.
But that's Mage.
But we still do things, and they will still be in a list, and you'll still be able to read them.
We don't know anything about testing, do we?
We are doing a test this weekend.
Okay.
I'm not sure when the schedule is
Just
exactly.
keep an eye out for your
Does Tyler know?
emails.
It's tomorrow.
It's tomorrow.
What time?
At
12 to 3.
If you can't hear it, Tyler's saying 12 to 3.
he's
We're
looking it up.
getting
We're figuring it out.
verification. I think it's on New Water Prep potentially.
I think it's on Wormling.
Is it on Wormling?
Yeah, we're staging soon.
Oh, we're staging on New Water Prep. Okay.
People
Tyler's
like
gonna get us the
you liked
actual.
your answers, by the way.
Oh, good.
Tyler's
3 EDT.
12 to what server?
Wormling.
All right, 12 to 3 on Warbling
IT
Eastern
Alpha Beta 1.
time.
IT Alpha Beta 1.
IT Alpha and Beta 1. If you didn't hear Tyler.
All right. Hopefully, we'll see you in the test.
All right, yeah, and mages are part of that test. So if you want to try some of this stuff out, you can make one of those and log in and join us.
Okay. See you later.
See you later.
Bye.